Back to the Jordan Report, and I'm your host, Robert Jordan. Everyone, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. All right, guys, I told everybody when that fence went up that it would be permanent. Those troops are also permanent. And I'm going to even go so far as to say we may even see armored vehicles out around our capital. And that's for one reason, people. These people in that capital are illegal. They have no right to be there, and they know that. And so their biggest fear is we the people. They're afraid of us, okay? So they're protecting themselves against us. Also, they're afraid of the most organized ones among us, and that would be the militia. And that's why they're saying all these things about the militia. I'm going to show you a local clip where they're talking about the Oath Keepers. I just discovered it was a Houston local channel where they call them the Oath Keepers domestic terrorists. I'm going to show you that clip in a minute, but let me give you an outline here. This was from yesterday. How to fix our domestic terrorist problem. We have a domestic terrorist problem. It's not Black Lives Matter. It's the militias, people, the constitutional militias. Domestic terrorism, a phenomenon formerly associated with left-wing groups. It was formerly associated with left-wing groups, such as the Weather Underground, Black Liberation Army, and the Puerto Rican FALN, separatists, has returned with blood in its eyes and on its hands. We saw 5 dead on January the 6th. It was an attempted coup, you guys. We saw possible assassination plots against former Vice President Mike Pence and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. We saw coercion designed to prevent certification of President Biden's electoral college victory. We saw the Capitol necessarily secured behind razor wire. It was necessarily secured behind razor wire. We also see some Republican members of Congress trying to sneak guns onto the House floor. One has even called for violence. It's time to confront these pushes. This is the language they're using, people, against the citizens of this country. Democrats such as Attorney General designate Merrick Garland and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer should use their executive and legislative power over the next 23 months to do the following 5 important things. First, bring the heaviest felony charges possible on as many participants in the insurrection as the Justice Department can identify and believes it can confidently convict. I already showed you an article where they were releasing these people because the charges were so small. They were just charging them for trespassing and curfew violation. They can't charge them with anything because they didn't do anything. So this is just a fallacious argument. We ruthlessly hunt down foreign terrorists after the September 11, 2001 attacks and must do the same to the domestic equivalents. Further prosecution is possible under the federal felony in possession of firearms statute. Second, make fire and police departments that receive federal grants. Listen to this, guys. Make fire and police departments that receive federal grants have their members sign commitments not to engage in acts to overthrow the government. I'm going to read that again. Make fire and police departments that receive federal grants have their members sign commitments not to engage in acts to overthrow the government. Prosecute anyone who subsequently violates their oath. We could also cut or suspend federal funding to departments that fail to introduce these measures. It's what we're doing to the universities that receive federal grant money and then promise to the contrary allow communist Chinese to walk off with export-controlled intellectual property paid for by the American taxpayer. Third, do not worry about Section 230 of Communications Decency Act. Rather than ban extremist chatter through government censorship or private deplatforming, use radical chat rooms as honeypots. It means set people up, as FBI-led Joint Terrorism Task Force have done with violent, radicalized Islamists since 2001. We need to draw out those of our fellow citizens who are willing to attack our nation. Fourth, use the supremacy of federal law to ban militias. Fourth, use the supremacy of federal law to ban militias. Beyond the National Guard, there's simply no longer any room for armed forces not answerable to the law. Okay? Fifth, add domestic terrorism as a predicate to the material support for terrorist statute, including civil liability provisions. This will provide new means of successful prosecutions and gradually increase the deterrence against domestic terrorists. This is who they see their fellow citizens as, people. Now let me show you what they said about the Oath Keepers. I just ran across this a couple of days ago. It's very interesting what they say about the Oath Keepers. This is from the local news channel in Houston.
Familiar to us now. On January 6th, thousands charged up and into the U.S. Capitol, intent to at least disrupt the joint session of Congress while they were certifying the Electoral College votes that would officially make Joe Biden the president of the United States. Included in that group charging up those steps were members of the Oath Keepers. Now the federal government is charging several of that group's leaders with planning the attack. Joining me now, Dr. Sam Jackson, the author of Oath Keepers, Patriotism and the Edge of Violence in a Right-Wing Anti-Government Group. Dr. Jackson is assistant professor in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University of Albany. Professor Jackson, good morning. Good to see you. You told me you started to write this book as a part of your dissertation. What was it about the Oath Keepers that attracted your attention?
I started the project around the time of the Bundy Ranch standoff, and if you'll remember back to 2014, there was this high-profile conflict out in the American West between a rancher who claimed that the federal government was violating his rights and agents of the federal government. And Oath Keepers were among those who responded to Cliven Bundy's call for supporters to come out and help him stand off the federal government. Mm-hmm. They came with their guns and with their body armor and other things to try to help Bundy protect his rights in their framing by whatever means they saw necessary.
So a couple of questions then. What is the Oath Keepers' foundational belief, and how have they focused their efforts to recruit?
Oath Keepers is organized around a perception that the federal government poses a very present and real threat to everyday Americans. In many ways, the federal government is in fact the main threat that Americans face. And Oath Keepers wants Americans to prepare for the possibility of conflict with the government in the future. And in particular, they want to recruit current and former members of law enforcement and the military, all of whom have taken an oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They want those members of law enforcement and the military to honor their oath as the Oath Keepers interpret that oath, and to pledge to proactively refuse to help the federal government engage in any tyrannical efforts.
And how do they most effectively use the social media and other avenues to advance their recruitment efforts?
They use a number of different social media platforms, from the common ones that many of us use, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, into some of the more isolated or obscure social media platforms, Gab, Voat, Telegram, these sorts of things. Over the past couple of months, though, they've seen some of the major social media platforms engage in moderation activities against them when prominent members of their organization have explicitly or perhaps even implicitly called for violence and criminal behavior.
So with that in mind, are they finding other ways to communicate, as far as you can tell at this point?
It's an ongoing situation. In the aftermath of the insurrection on January 6th, their website host actually stopped providing services for them, and their website came down for a while, which has been their website also hosts a forum, which had been a major space for them to communicate. And in the days after their website was taken down, they found a new host, and their website is back up. They are also, as I mentioned, active on some of these other social media platforms, Parler, Telegram. But as we've seen, some of those platforms themselves have faced challenges regarding providing access and the service being available to users. So it's kind of this ongoing situation where Oath Keepers directly or the services they rely on try to be available and sort of struggle to do so.
So yeah, this was not necessarily a particular focus of your book, but from what you studied, based on the environment we're in now, are these groups likely to grow and multiply or decrease in number as a place for the disaffected to go? Because it sounds like one of their pulls is, if you're disaffected, if you're angry about one thing or another, this is the place for you. Do you have any sense about whether or not these groups are going to continue to thrive at all, or is that too early to tell?
That's a difficult question, and in a lot of ways, I think it's too early to tell. We're seeing in the aftermath of January 6th, and even more importantly, in the aftermath of Joe Biden's inauguration a few days ago, that some members of Oath Keepers and other similar groups are having to rethink their understanding of the world and American politics. Many of them were adherents of the QAnon conspiracy theory and believed that Joe Biden would not be inaugurated as the next president. Now that he is, they're having to rethink their understanding of the world. And I think that process of remaking sense of things is really going to shape the extent to which Oath Keepers can grow, can continue to be relevant as an organization. But more broadly, I don't think that the movement that Oath Keepers is part of is going anywhere. I would expect it to stay around for a while.
Your College of Emergency Preparedness is focused on all of this, I would guess. What's the general consensus about our challenges ahead about domestic terrorism? The FBI has indicated that it was going to be one of the biggest challenges we face. Do your colleagues tend to agree with that?
More broadly, scholars who have researched extremism and terrorism have for a number of years been trying to raise the issue of domestic extremism and terrorism in the U.S. And for a number of different reasons, over a number of different years, that has largely fallen on deaf ears, I suppose. There were some promising signs towards the end of the Obama administration in particular, which were quickly reversed by the Trump administration. I think many of us are hopeful now that the government is going to be a more engaged and realistic partner in addressing some of these issues. But we also, many of us are urging the government not to pass new laws that would classify some of these organizations or even some of these actions as domestic terrorism. Many of us think that the laws that we have on the books are sufficient as long as law enforcement and prosecutors and departments of justice are willing to apply those laws, investigate things that need to be investigated, and take threats seriously.
Dr. Sam Jackson, thank you so much. Deep thoughts, a lot of good things to talk about, a lot of things that we need to know about. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Okay, guys. Our militias now are domestic terrorists.